Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's been a little bit of time since our last community conversation on walkable, bikeable neighborhoods. And so thanks for joining us today. That's great. We've got a good, diverse group. Well, for those of you that do not know me, my name is Sarah Stans. I serve as the Community Resilience Director for the Park County Environmental Council, and we're just thrilled to host another community conversation today. This conversation is part of an ongoing series about community planning where we discuss tools, planning strategies that really help us foster positive growth, growth that's really determined by members of the public, such as yourself, for community benefit. So some of these city and county planning tools can be found on our website. So if you've missed some of those community conversations, I'll pop a link into the chat where you can find some of those. That's been topics around affordable housing, the Park County Housing Action Plan, short-term rentals, walkable neighborhood strategies, Gardner's neighborhood plan, and then the MSU students project where they reimagined downtown Livingston project. Let me see. And there's a bunch of YouTube videos that you can get caught up. So I'm going to do a quick introduction about PCEC and then introduce you to our guest today, who will take us through the exciting new Livingston Trails and Active Transportation Plan. And then we'll open it up to a conversation. So please keep in mind that this is a draft document. It's been viewed and passed unanimously, both by the Parks and Trails Board as well as the Planning Board, and will be presented to the City Commission for final adoption on April 19th. You can tune into that meeting. It's on a Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. And I'll pop those links into the chat as well so that they're easy access. So first, just a little Zoom housekeeping. We're all used to this by now, but please keep on mute if you're not speaking, just respectful of anyone that's speaking or asking questions. If you have any questions, throw them into the chat. We'll do our best to answer them as they arise, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end to answer those questions. As always, today's presentation is recorded and it will be shared on our website. We're also on Facebook Live, so hi everybody out there who's joining us on social media. So PCEC, for those that aren't familiar, is a local community conservation group. We've got 650 contributing members, 3,000 supporters here in Park County, and we work with people to safeguard the land, the water, wildlife, and communities here in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway through grassroots organizing and advocacy. So Park County is the traditional homeland and current home to many Indigenous people, including the Upsaloga or the Crow tribe. And Park County today has a long tradition of human habitation, of people who are deeply connected to this land, who love, cherish, and steward this place. And we are committed to working together to honor that legacy and this place for future generations. So some of you may be wondering why a grassroots conservation group cares about trails and active transportation. And well, it's because we believe that taking care of people in our community is central to our mission and values. And we believe that people need safe and accessible streets and pathways in order for our community to really thrive. And we really believe that every person, no matter what age, what ability, they should be really able to leave their home, get to schools, errands, and recreate in this beautiful place without having to depend on the expense of a car. When we advocate for AT, it doesn't mean that everyone has to walk and bike, and we do not need to get rid of cars. But the point is that by investing in trails and AT, is that we provide more choices and more opportunities for individuals that benefit more people, such as lowering taxes, reinvigorating our downtown, supporting local businesses, creating more vibrant neighborhoods, and providing independence for youth and disabled. So I guess the biggest point in Livingston is that, as more people drive less and there's, less vehicle congestion and it's reduced, our health improves, and all of a sudden maybe school traffic and the crossing the tracks is a non-issue. So as an advocacy partner in this whole link of people that is needed in trails and active transportation, It's really important in areas such as the Northeast that have been previously neglected in our town. It's a place where I grew up, and the lack of access to trails and parks and sidewalks hasn't really changed much since the 80s. Saying that, our city has really embraced a new vision. It's changed a lot since I've grown up here, and the city really knows the overarching value of creating safe streets and pathways, and ultimately investing in this plan. So in the recent years, City and Public Works has invested and implemented over $9 million in improving ADA infrastructure, upgrading sidewalks, ramps, and alleys. They've got some beautiful maps that they can show you on where these improvements have been made, and you can check it out on their website. And this is something that we should all really celebrate and get behind and recognize as an immense improvement. And it can only continue to get better as we work towards a common vision. So today, we are talking about Livingston's first Trails and Active Transportation Plan. This document captures the community vision that was developed with many partners and stakeholders, many that are here today, with lots of input over the past year with Vitruvian consultants and Don, who's here as our guest, and his team are at the helm. So we hope citizens and advocates, such as yourselves, will walk away excited about this plan, excited to work with us, and really armed with the tools and resources needed to start implementing this vision. So I'm going to introduce Dawn and then let you take it away. So Dawn is the project manager of Vitruvian Planning in Boise, and is the project manager for Livingston Trails and Active Transportation Plan. He has over 20 years experience in transportation planning, health analysis, comprehensive planning. In addition to his consulting work, he served on the board of trails and active transportation advocacy organizations in North Carolina and Idaho. And today he will really focus on showcasing ideas for citizens and advocates to be partners in implementing this plan. So he's been a complete asset to this community and is dedicated to our vision. Thank you, Dawn, and the floor is all yours.
Sarah, let me share this here. First of all, I want to thank those of you on the call that have provided us the hospitality and input through the steering committee and just joining us on the walk and bike journeys throughout Livingston. In total, we spent 2 full weeks on the ground there on 2 separate occasions last year to help develop this plan in coordination with the Bozeman area and the regional nonprofit Future West, as well as Kathy Kostelec. You're down there somewhere. Kathy's now a retired health professional from the Bozeman area, but has worked statewide. And if any of you remember the BACI or Bocce Institute on Walkability that was brought to Livingston a few years ago, Kathy was the lead person of that. So those folks provided our local context. So Sarah asked me to do this, and I was pleased because it's something as a consultant and working on these plans I never get to do, and that is give the community members and advocates the handoff to say what's next and what can you do as a member of the community to help this plan become implemented. In a city of the size of Livingston, there's always going to be challenges related to the city staff and budgetary resources with so many things that have to go on. In a city with an older footprint like yours, you're going to have underground water pipes and utilities and other things that need to be done, in addition to replacing old sidewalks, building new curb ramps for people with disabilities, and then also thinking about where you add sidewalks, bikeways, and trails to the system. So that's this overall challenge that we have. And even if you are in New York City and follow the active transportation advocates there, and you think they have a great system, they are also just as frustrated in lots of ways. So do not feel alone from the large and small cities in our country, even those that might be the best in terms of access to active transportation. And that's the case because when we are walking, biking, hiking, we are experiencing our environment in a way that we never do when we're driving. We are experiencing it through almost all of our senses. And that becomes very personal. That one little dip in a road on your bike or that one little missing gap of sidewalk is very different experience, especially for a child, someone with disabilities, or an older adult that might have just mobility challenges getting around. Every driver in this country in a city can pretty much pull out of their house, be on a paved road that will get them to wherever their destination will be, most likely on another paved road, unless they are going out to enjoy the great outdoors. We do not provide that to somebody wanting to walk out of their house. And again, that's not a criticism of Livingston or any place in Montana. It's no different here in Idaho. If I were to turn my video off, you would see a picture of a man in a wheelchair having to use the center turn lane of a major road here in the Boise area. That while we're widening roads for motorists who won't exist for another 20 years, a man in a wheelchair has to ride in the street on one of our largest traffic arteries. Those are the challenges we face to counter those things. And those of you on this call are the ones that need to be the voices for that. So I want to kind of go through what I'm calling the citizen and advocate survival guide for this. So let's first start off with, here's you. It often feels like you have to surf the tsunami, right? You have other things in life to do, jobs, family, other interests. You just want to go out for a walk, take a bike ride, or go for a hike. But you also have to play a role in making sure those systems are improved. And it can be intimidating, especially in a small town where the resources are more limited. And oftentimes we're only relying on our larger state departments of transportation to provide that expertise. And really, those are organizations that are not very well equipped to address these fine-grained needs in communities very well. And in my experience, actually, MDT in your state is slightly better than state DOTs in other states, but they also have the same limitations being a smaller state agency. So it can seem like you're having to surf the tsunami to get that trail extension, to get that safer bike route, or to get that safer crossing of something like Park Street, just to do something basic like get to the grocery store. That is no problem for somebody driving in a car. And here's a couple of examples. As we explored your streets, just think about the fact that a parent has to go out with a small child and navigate across a busy road and railroad tracks and compete with vehicles for space just to walk a half mile or so to a convenience store, a school, or a park. In essence, we have failed our population on these policies as a country, and that's what we have to address and mitigate and understand. As Sarah said, not everybody has to walk or bike. And the reality in a town like Livingston is, unless you can find a local job, unless maybe you're working from home, we're probably going to have at least one member in our household who is having to commute a longer distance by vehicle. And that's understandable. But when they get back home to Livingston, they should not have to also be forced to drive to go to a grocery school, a park, a school, a community meeting, or downtown. And that's where we start to separate this discussion, because so much of our transportation data is strict, and decisions for that matter, are based on how people commute. And if you think about this, we spend billions of dollars a year as a country to address the peak 1 hour of traffic congestion. Our roads are built for 1 hour a day when it comes to capacity. And as a result, we can never get to the proper conversations about how do we address somebody who might want to walk somewhere the other 23 hours a day. So what we want to do is help you get to higher ground, so you're not having to surf that tsunami, and get to the top of some of your wonderful trails and neighborhoods. In this example, at the end of Summit Street, is on private land and is what we call a desire line, or a that provides a great connection in the future to access neighborhoods and recreational opportunities on the north side of town. But that's going to take an effort to acquire the land and build the pathway and make it usable. That's what our plan helped identify and prioritize. And maybe if the private landowner came in here and wanted to develop this property, do we have to have the line and the trail going exactly as it currently is? Not necessarily. We should have the flexibility to negotiate with them, and maybe we wrap it around to the right side or to the left side to get the connectivity, because oftentimes that's the negotiation that has to occur when we're trying to, what we would call, exact these improvements from a private developer. So here's some things about the people of Livingston. And if somebody says, oh, nobody walks or bikes, well, 11%, and this is based on some previous census data, walk or bike to work every day. That's a pretty good proportion. The vast majority of those are people who walk. Roughly 1 out of 4 people in your community are either too young to drive or are reaching an age where driving is becoming increasingly difficult in terms of skills and reactions and other things. But oftentimes we force people of these older ages to drive because we don't provide them the safe access to a drugstore, to a senior center, and to other places. Roughly 1 in 8 people in Livingston have some type of disability that could impact how they cross a street, for example. If a traffic signal and the pedestrian signal gives you too little time, a person with a disability may not have time to cross there. And if they have the misfortune of being hit, oftentimes we will say, oh, they were in the crosswalk after the light had turned. But we never considered, did we actually give that person enough time to cross at that particular location? Roughly 1 in 12 households lack access to a vehicle in Livingston, meaning they don't have that choice. And oftentimes another figure is the amount of people in households that have access to only one vehicle. So maybe one person is commuting that long distance while another person remains in town for work and other things and must commute via different means. And then overall, we are getting older as a society, which changes our paradigm quite considerably. And you have 1 in 5 residents that are over the age of 65. This is kind of our most captive market for these things and the individuals that are doing the walking and biking on a regular basis, not those that have a choice to. But even with that, those numbers are still significant. Beyond that, from a health assessment, and this is what Kathy helped us do, almost 1 in 5 report having poor or fair health. And so things like walking and bicycling don't just have a physical health impact, they have a mental health impact, and an environmental health impact, and a social health impact, and all those other things. And as you can see, right around 14% are reporting their physical and mental health is not good. 1 in 3 are diagnosed with high blood pressure, as well as probably 1 in 3 diagnosed with obesity. So these are all the types of things that walking, biking is proving to help. And in the health profession these days, it's all about doing what they call getting upstream. Hospitals are starting to realize the cost of care and the demand for their services is oftentimes better addressed by people not having to come to a hospital. Health is not health care. We are in poor health when we have to seek health care. So how can we prevent people from doing this? And so the fact that you have the trail connections and other things to your hospital is a great mindset for a hospital to pursue. And there are several examples of health organizations funding pathways and trails or wayfinding and other things. And we hope you have the ability to pursue those partnerships in your community. So oftentimes we feel like the implementation of these plans can move at the speed of plate tectonics, really slow. And we have to deal with earthquakes and tsunamis and revolutions and political upheaval over time to get that sidewalk gap filled. And that's how it feels, that it's going to take us a long time to get from the plan to the project. Kudos to the city of Livingston at this point, because when the draft plan began being circulated in its final form about 3 or 4 months ago, the city's Public Works Department, utilizing a federal funding pot that comes down from MDT, has already begun programming $630,000 worth of projects that we identified in the plan as your top priorities. These are primarily sidewalk and bikeway projects because they must be done within the right-of-way of certain designated streets in Livingston, but they are moving toward programming those to show you we don't have to wait for these tectonic shifts to have that occur. So kudos to the city staff for that. And that's something you as advocates can support when the city commission goes to formally adopt those and stay engaged when they begin design. So some of the things we identified out there, here we have major roads. As I said, that driver can leave their house and get to any destination on a paved road, yet we have to create our own goat paths alongside streets to do this. And this is in an area that Sarah mentioned, has historically maybe not received some of the investment. And this is a crossing right near a park, a place that the people who live within a quarter to a half mile of here should be able to safely access and get their kids there and hopefully allow their kids enough freedom and independence to do that on their own. But I'm imagining a lot of parents won't allow their children to cross a street like Gallatin without somebody else being with them because of the other characteristics that are there. I call pictures like this the ghost of mobility past. Sidewalks were the standard transportation infrastructure 100 years ago. We didn't have to have zoning codes to require developers to build sidewalks. They built them because that's how the vast majority of people got around. And we have both let those things decay, as we see here, and we have failed to fill gaps in the sidewalks as our city limits have expanded. And again, this isn't a unique problem for Livingston. It is a uniquely American thing that we have sacrificed so much and allowed our infrastructure to deteriorate, where the concept of even walking may not be attainable. Imagine the person in a wheelchair who cannot navigate this having to use the street to get to their destination. Imagine what happens if they were hit by a passing motorist. And oftentimes the police report or the media report is, we don't know why they were in the street. Why were they there at that time of day? We never ask a driver why they were there at that time of day and why they were using that street. So those are some of the biases you as advocates have to help us overcome. This man, I watched him go across to Town and Country, pick up some food, and come back. And you can see here, I'd like to say that the brakes were for this driver to yield to this man at the crosswalk. No, they hit the brakes a little too late and zoomed right past him. And here's another flaw in our laws. This man is not in a position that trips the requirement for the driver to stop for them. You have to physically be in the crosswalk to trip Montana's law that forces a driver to yield. So you have to physically be in harm's way in order for the law to be on your side. This is signed as a school zone. A child has to physically put themselves in harm's way before it trips the legal requirement for a driver to stop. That's a state law that advocates could advocate with others to change, to create safer conditions. We can't solve that in a plan, but what we did say in this plan is, here is a crossing to both the grocery store. You have an older motel on the opposite side of the tracks that appears to be being used as some type of short-term or permanent housing. And you have your other shopping complex with the Ace Hardware and other stores. And so this is a place with an MDT route where we would do what's called a rapid flash beacon, or this man being able to push a button that alerts motorists to his presence and starts the flashers, which will prompt a higher yielding rate, especially for motorists to stop before this person has to enter the crosswalk. He still has the problem of crossing the street and getting to the railroad side of Park Street that is almost void of sidewalks. That's a whole other set of issues. And addressing those things definitely gets into that plate tectonics timeline to be done. But certainly the ability to cross Park Street is probably one of your bigger community, both physical as well as psychological barriers to help overcome. We address things like this. You are the northern gateway to Yellowstone, and nothing says welcome to nature and our country's most majestic park than when you get off the interstate and you're met with this type of sign clutter. And so we have a section in there that I think a great community initiative beyond just the bike ped piece would be, what can you do at this exit to create a true northern gateway to Yellowstone and that area, as well as the city of Livingston, and do things like better landscaping, reduce the sign clutter, do more context, what we call context sensitive design that MDT has a whole manual about. To ask those questions. Obviously, those are bigger issues than walking and biking, but here you have a trail there that I think a lot of people enjoy, but I don't know that this part of it is a very enjoyable environment for them or for motorists, for that example. So that's where we can start to tie those modes and investments together. Here is what I would call the universe of projects that we identified, at least within the city limits of Livingston. If you see a dotted green line, that is a proposed trail project that would link to, in some cases, especially along the river, existing trail projects. Where you only see a blue line, that is a route we identified for what we would call bikeway upgrades. That's essentially some striping of some bicycle markings, perhaps some wayfinding signage, and hopefully what we would call some speed management techniques that would naturally enforce the desired speed limit so people would be more comfortable using the streets. You don't have a lot of great opportunities to easily go in and stripe bike lanes on some of the streets just due to their cross-section nature. Some would require prohibiting parking, which can be discussed and pursued, and communities have, but you can imagine how that is oftentimes a harder conversation to have. The peach colored lines are sidewalk only recommendations. And then the ones that are kind of the combination of the dotted red and dotted green are both add sidewalks, upgrade sidewalks, and create bikeways along those streets. The 12 projects you see that are lettered there are what were determined through evaluating the projects to be your top tier or your top 12 out of about 36 projects. These are the ones that we identified in more detail and tried to define them a little better so the city, like I said in the beginning, could move with implementation of those. So to back that up a second, we have about 36 total projects that could be done in Livingston. We determined that there were 12 that constituted your top tier. And those are the things that those of you as advocates can work to help implement maybe in the next decade. And based on my experience in cities of your size, if you got those 12 done in the next decade, you would be outperforming most of your peer communities. It's great that the city is already starting to program portions of about 5 of them. The trail side of this is a little different and can be a little bit more complex to understand. What we did within the Trails Master Plan was identified what we would call a desirable set of trails that also included connections outside the city limits within Park County's jurisdiction. We then had to say which of these projects are in a situation that if the city did want to go out and build them tomorrow, we have either the land ownership or a positive land situation in terms of the private owner that could, in theory, make these a project. So within this particular map, the dotted lines were those that the steering committee and input determined the situation appeared to be one that might be desirable for the city to go out and pursue constructing those based on the land configurations. There are other lines on the map in the overall Trails Master Plan that will be much more complex to implement. And as a result, you don't see them as a defined project. They are there to help both the city and county preserve those routes if you do have development or other pressures proposed along that. And that's a lot to say, and I will touch on that a little later. In general, these are those 12 top tier projects defined by their street name or location, especially those along the river. If you see SW and BW, that's a sidewalk and a bikeway. The PW is a pathway. The TR is a trail. A pathway is generally seen as a wider 2 or 3 wide, like you have existing along the river. A trail is something more like through your North Hills area that might be what a mountain biker would call a single track trail. So all of these things are a combination of those in some form. Pathways, because they are wider, tend to be multi-use and can be used by bicyclists and pedestrians, although that may not always be desirable. There are plenty of examples of unpaved pathways that pedestrians and bicyclists use and can be made compliant for people with disabilities. Your state DOT does not agree with that, but that's only a position and not a policy. And I would be lying if I said we didn't go round and round with them a little bit about that. There are a lot of wonderful gravel compacted unpaved trails that people in wheelchairs can use just fine. It does not have to be paved, but that's a fight you might have to support as advocates to pursue grants and other things, particularly with the state. All of this is detailed in the 103 pages of the plan. We also have a story map that I think you've received a link to that gives you the more digestible version, and let the 103-page one be for the wonks and the people at the city to use, or maybe for you to reference when you want to get down to more details. So your role as a citizen and an advocate, you are a gnat. And I mean that in the most positive way possible. You need to buzz around at a low volume. You maybe need to increase that volume, but the more numbers you have and the more buzzing you do, the more you are recognized and understood. So how can you be a gnat in the positive sense of the term? Let's start with be a YIMBY. A NIMBY is a not in my backyard. A YIMBY is a yes in my backyard. You can write or you can show up at the presentation next Monday on the 18th for the City Commission and express your support for this and express your support for the City Commission to already begin approving the city staff to put those projects in the CIP. That is vitally important. Just because you gave positive feedback already doesn't mean you don't need to keep giving feedback. And every time the YIMBY shows up, it can counteract the NIMBY that might be opposing some of these projects. And oftentimes elected officials only hear from the NIMBY side of things, because if somebody's emotions are stirred in a negative way, they are much more motivated to show up and speak against something than those of us who are speaking for something. Volunteer your time. I attempted in our 2 weeks there to take as many pictures as I could of people trying to use the streets and trails. If you are out there walking and biking and see somebody in a difficult situation or a positive situation, take pictures of them using the facilities. We see cars in a lot of situations because they take up so much space. Yet people will say, I never see anybody using that trail. Well, it's simply because they are harder to see because they take up less space and they tend to move a little more efficiently because the trails and pathways and sidewalks are not congested. So you might have to dispel the myths about that. One of the program recommendations we have is to organize a count program where you would go out on a common week each year and go to maybe a dozen key locations in your city to count the number of pedestrians and bicyclists that are using a particular route or a particular crossing. And I would caution you on that to go out and count locations like that Bennett Street crossing where I showed the mother and daughter. Why? Because one, if we know today that there are 20 people using that in a 3-hour time period, one, we can make the case for the project, but two, great data to have is what we would call pre and post usage. Hey, we knew we had 20 people crossing there in 3 hours when the facilities were crap. Well, we've made the facilities where we made a connection and wow, we have 50 people or we have 100 people. And that shows the value of that investment. But that's something the city is not likely to have the time or the resources to do. But a group like PCEC could go out, get the volunteers, find the forms online and do those counts. You already have done some walk and bike audits for different parts of the city. I would encourage you to continue to do that. If the city is programming a project to do sidewalks or a bikeway on a particular route, then organize with them a walk and bike audit along that route, hopefully with the project engineers who are designing the project to give them your firsthand feedback. That is vital to the design process and can help those folks see things that they might not otherwise see, especially if it's an engineering firm that's brought in from another city, which is oftentimes the case. Ask the staff about the assistance they would appreciate. In our final steering committee meeting last night, Martha, who worked with the city and talking about the trails, was like, yeah, we're gonna need some help on some trail building and some trail maintenance and things. And just ask them what role you would like to play. The great part is you're a small city. You don't have 30 layers of bureaucracy to get through to talk to a person like if you were in Seattle or LA or Chicago. These folks are your neighbors. Many times they are your friends and they are working with the same goals, but they also are being pulled in so many ways. Just find out what they could use from you today. So that's all about being a positive gnat and helping your community along. I mentioned before the overall Trails Master Plan. This is that collection of those lines on the map. The priority trail, or excuse me, the solid line is existing trails. The priority trails are those that we identified, as I said, in that project ranking that could become tangible projects. The illustrative trails are other trails that would be really nice to have, but have other feasibility issues that we just couldn't define them at this point as a specific project. And then the blue dotted lines tend to be outside city jurisdiction. We have a couple corrections on this because there's a couple of them that are on city-owned land, but not within city limits. I think Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong on that. The importance of this map for both the city of Livingston and Park County to adopt it in their subdivision and zoning ordinances is this. If I'm a developer, and if you can see my arrow, if I'm a developer and I'm developing this land over here, I'm going to either come to the city of Livingston and ask perhaps for annexation, or I'm going to go to the county and ask for approval of my development. In the planning world, we have a term called rational nexus, which means when a public agency makes a requirement on a private landowner for development, it has to be tied to something reasonable and rational. Otherwise, you could get sued. If Park County and the city both adopt in their zoning ordinance that we endorse the Trails Master Plan map from this plan, and that developers who come in on properties that where these lines are shown need to either dedicate the land or physically build the trail as intended in that map. It means you don't have to negotiate whether or not they do it. You just have to negotiate where specifically they put it in the property. It's important for the county and the city to have the same language in their code, because it could lead to a developer saying, oh, if the county doesn't have that in their code, I'll go try to get my development approved through the county and not annexed to the city, or vice versa. Now, there's other reasons they may do that, but if both the city and the county are on board with that, your chances of achieving this master plan of trails is greatly, greatly increased. So another example would be up here along the river, northeast of town, north of the highway, north of the tracks. That's definitely a route along the river that should be a pathway in the future. And if a developer came in and wanted to do that, and the city had it in its policies, they could say, yes, you are required to dedicate the land for us to put in a 10 or a 12-foot wide pathway. Ideally, that pathway would follow the riverbanks, and because of other floodplain issues, the developer couldn't really put a lot of permanent structures in that. But maybe they want to deviate that pathway through one part of their property. That's okay. Their development and what they propose for a trail doesn't have to specifically follow these lines, as long as the getting from point A to point B intention is met. So it allows a city or a county some negotiation to do those kind of things. And I think Sarah has a good example where on the Summit Street extension, there was a proposed vacation of the right-of-way through here that could have drastically limited a vital trail connection in the future. So had this map been adopted and in place at that time, the advocacy and other efforts to help get a better solution for that might have been a lot easier for you to undertake. So I say that to say this: I cannot stress enough the importance of getting both the city and the county to adopt this map in their formal codes for those purposes. So with that, because that's a very technical issue, I wanted to pause to see if anybody had a question on this particular aspect of the plan and why it's important.
Hi, this is Jessie Wilcox. I do have a plan, actually. Thanks, Dawn.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, for development that maybe is planned or already, like, so say, you know, there's already some stuff in the works, and this plan doesn't get adopted in until next week when the city commission votes on it. At what point are some of these other developments, maybe it's not a subdivision that's been approved yet, but the property's been annexed in and it's been zoned and it's sort of known that the developer's planning to build there. Is there like a grandfathered in clause, will we have to wait for this to be implemented and passed and adopted by the city and the county, and then moving forward we can kind of advocate because it's been brought in? Or I don't know if that I'm making sense.
So you kind of you definitely are summarizing kind of the where you can get stuck in between this. My understanding, as it was described to me in a Montana perspective, is historically, let me back up. In most cases, in most situations, pick a city anywhere in the country. The prevailing law is that once a subdivision gets approved in terms of its plat and its layout, that application approval is generally good for a period of about 3 years. So they have 3 years to move on the actions stipulated in that approval. They can maybe ask for an extension, or they can come in with a new application. My understanding is in the past in Montana is that could be individually negotiated and granted to a property owner with all kinds of timelines. And I think you might be in that situation there, but I'm not an attorney. I haven't been close to them. I'm secondhand relaying a story. If you are at that point and maybe something is in the hopper and moving, your best bet is to negotiate with that landowner for some sort of dedication and what would be called a development agreement or a license agreement or something else. So there are mechanisms to do it, but there's nothing that the city or the county can stipulate from a legal standpoint if it was not part of the original application approval. And that's why it's important to formally adopt this map within the code so you have that standing at the start to get that dedicated easement and perhaps construction of the trail in place.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I'll say that too, that maybe tomorrow, next year, next month, whatever, and if you can see my mouse, maybe we say, oh, we really want a pathway here. Well, let's go out, maybe look at it, and let's adopt a map amendment. And that's a totally valid process. A good zoning or subdivision ordinance will just say that the trails master plan map is the official map of record, which means you can amend that map when you need to. And it just says the latest version. So if you go through the city or the county with a resolution to amend the map 2 years from now to add a couple other lines, and as long as they're within reason and reason why they're put there, the code would then apply to the updated map without you having to change the code. So that's another important factor in this. I have provided the city with some of the code language that your partners in Bozeman have that help build this into the subdivision and the zoning ordinance. And I just didn't pick it because it was Bozeman. I attempted to find them from other cities in Montana, and I felt theirs was the best of the bunch in terms of something you could copy into their code to put you into the best situation to do that. I mentioned and showed you the picture of the crossings. And so if the city is going out to fill a sidewalk gap, do a bikeway, or do something more comprehensive on a corridor, understanding the needs for upgrading these crossings simultaneously is an important thing to scope into that. There are different methods that are now in place that we didn't have as tools 8, 10, 12 years ago. I mentioned what's called a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. This is essentially a pedestrian crossing sign and a crosswalk where when you push a button, it activates a LED flashing yellow light. That is simply to raise the awareness that a pedestrian is intending to cross. And for the most part, most of the portions of your city, with the exception of maybe Park Street, from maybe where, let's see, what did I put D as? I put D as Park and 8th as a rapid flash beacon, and E as that. But if you go to G, we have what's called a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And this is one that the red lights actually start flashing to force motorists to stop, but then they can proceed once a pedestrian has cleared the crosswalk. The reason that location G is there is because that's at a point where that road is wider. and a little bit faster. And that's generally the considerations that would elevate the consideration from a rapid flashing beacon to a pedestrian hybrid beacon. The good thing about the yellow flashing lights as pairs is they are solar powered and can be mounted for anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 for a pair of them. So say you went in and got a grant for $100,000, chances are you could probably do 5 or 6 locations, as well as upgrading things like the curb ramps for ADA compliance and striping the crosswalk. So there's a couple different ways you can pursue these, but this is where we saw certain types of crossings were needed based on the characteristics of the traffic that's there. So I've covered the projects piece, and that's usually the highest and most visible piece of that, but there are other parts of this plan. Tim, I see you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Hey, Don, thanks for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I don't know if this fits with the flow, but I'll just throw it out there since you were on it. I have a particular bee in my bonnet about the crossing of Park Street at Main, right after you come under the underpass.
Okay.
There.
Yes.
I commute downtown on foot, and I've been doing that crossing for 20 years. And you can imagine the taking one's life into one's own hands when one crosses the street. I had heard that, and I just recently, put this on the city commission. I know it's not the first time they've heard it, but I have also heard that MDT has been resistant to the idea of doing the strobing, flashing crossings across Park Street, and I'm wondering why, and if that actually is resistance, or if that, like, what's the deal there with their issue with having these flashing pedestrian crossings.
I was equally perplexed hearing that, because in my professional opinion, first of all, every intersection in the state of Montana is a legal crosswalk, whether one is painted or not. And so you as a pedestrian have the same rights in those, and a driver has the same responsibility to yield. And a rapid flash beacon is only accentuating or raising what we would call conspicuity, or making your move more conspicuous to the driver to do that. If it's the fact that MDT is opposed to those, I would hit back with that. We are just trying to raise the visibility of someone exerting their rights under Montana law to cross at a legal crosswalk. That would be the first step. The other thing that I think is perplexing about that, there's certainly an interest because of what happens when the interstate is closed to still provide some continuity and progression of traffic along Park Street because of what happens when that occurs. That's exactly why I recommended the rapid flash beacons in most of these locations, because it does not bring about a red light that may delay motorists beyond what they might see as a tolerable threshold. And so that's the case I would make, is that the rapid flash beacon shown to have a very high yield rate, a very good rate of reducing crash potential, but also does the least to delay drivers. And all you're asking for, Tim, in that crossing is for drivers to obey the law like they are already required to do. And these lights help bring about a reminder that they have that law applying to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm just trying to take notes here. So you said show a high yield rate, decrease accident potential, and then lower traffic delays. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's great.
And I could get more guerrilla with it and go, I'd rather see a raised crosswalk and some curb extensions and other things, but I'm also sensitive to their interest in the role that Park Street serves when that's closed. So in my mind, a $15,000 or $20,000 investment in the rapid flash beacons should be the sweet spot and the best of both worlds. I'll say this, because I will say, I guess we're among friends. We have a goal in the plan that, hey, we need to help pedestrians and bicyclists find routes other than Park Street, right? I mean, that's a noble thing. You have some of those. And the moment that MDT saw that we had projects proposed along Park Street, they said, well, what about your goal of other routes? And my response is, people still have to cross and reach destinations. And the federal guidance that MDT buys into says pedestrians and bicyclists must have access to the same destinations as motorists. And that's all you're trying to do in this situation. Joshua.
Got to unmute myself. Hi, Don. Thanks so much for the presentation. I wanted to just introduce myself and my organization. I'm the chair of the Park County Fairgrounds and Parks Board. And I also sit on the Trails and Bridges Committee, which is very related. And we're super excited about this plan. And we're out here. I just want to make people aware that we're out here, and we are looking closely at this plan, and we're interested in dealing with any of these spots where the trails you're proposing kind of run into county land, and making sure those tie in well, as well as just addressing it holistically, partnering with our city friends so that this thing is as great as it can be.
You know, that's good to hear. I was going to, if you took the final survey link, where really all I did was ask about 3 different bike ped or trails projects for people to choose their favorite. Their top trail one was one of these 2 links down here around both the fairgrounds and the golf course. And the reason there are 2 lines there is to give options. There are different property circumstances, of which the fairgrounds obviously plays into, but I think the citizens ranking that as their highest one just shows the demand given the gap that's in the system there, and obviously all the work being done with the pathway crossing of the river down at Mayor's Landing. So from the advocacy side and your role, that is, you know, something to keep the conversation going, because on paper and an aerial, it might be easy, but the complexities could be unearthed really quickly in that one.
Absolutely. There's a couple bridges. There's that big one, of course, over the Yellowstone that we would love to see and tie the trail systems together. There's also a lesser known one over Fleshman Creek that would take people from the dog park over to the high letter streets that this sort of talks about a little bit, but there may be the area
I'm circling.
It is, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
There may be funding opportunities that funding could potentially come in and be earmarked for a bridge like this. That, you know, the money wouldn't go towards anything else. It would have to be a pedestrian bridge style thing. So there may be opportunity there that project could get elevated on the priority list, and we could have a connection from Mayor's Landing into the high letter streets all the way to Park Street and the rest of those trails that go out across Veterans Bridge to the hospital, et cetera. And then, of course, the big, really exciting one is the single arc bridge that would go over the Yellowstone for pedestrians and tie in with the trails on the other side of the river.
Yeah, good point. I think you also raise another point that in our effort with the 30 some odd projects and identifying a top tier, that's kind of meant for the here and now. But as I said to the steering committee and others, if there's a lower tier project that emerges as an opportunity, don't ignore it because it's not number 1 or number 5 or number 12. We can't possibly account for every intangible on a project or other things that may arise. So don't miss an opportunity if they arise to stick to a list, and maybe in 5 years or so, you might look as a community to amend that list. Lindsay.
Hi. I was just thinking about how you were saying, you know, we build roads for rush hour traffic 20 years in the future, and we only ever ask how many people bike or walk right now. Do we ever ask how many people would like to or would if there wasn't terrible infrastructure?
Yes, we do. And we attempted with this survey, but in the grand scheme of how transportation preferences and things are done, it generally is not. There's also the saying of, well, no, why should we build a bike lane here when nobody bikes there? And the great comment about that is we don't build a new bridge across the river based on how many people are swimming across it. And so that's the big bias we have to fight. I also get frustrated to hear, well, we don't have any money. And I'm like, well, if we can widen a road for what the motorist traffic is projected to be in the year 25 or in 25 years, and we have the money for that, then I think we have the money to build a sidewalk for the people that are here today. It's a matter of priorities and interest more so than it is funding. And I will climb off that soapbox temporarily.
Thanks.
All right, so finish up and then we'll get to some other questions. Partnerships. And this is where I think, you know, this group, the organizations you're involved with, PCEC, and others can be thinking about this. And I like this thing about pain share and gain share, because I think we've all, you know, been through that painful part of certain things, but we've realized the fruits of that on the end. And I tend to look at this from a partnership of what we call a give and a gain. What, when we are seeking a partnership, do we want somebody to give? But when we ask them for that, we should be understanding what they stand to gain, because I think that changes how we ask for something, and it may even change what we think we can ask for. The obvious give when we ask people for things is money. Help us build this thing. But there are certain partners that might not be able to fully do that. Go back to the health foundation examples. They are more likely to help fund a pathway signage or wayfinding project than they are the actual physical construction of one. So if you are moving toward doing something like building a pathway or building a bikeway, you could go to the health foundation of your hospital and maybe ask them to contribute the additional funding to do the wayfinding and the distances and the other maybe softer side of those. Certainly with an MDT and a city and a county, you know, that's about money, but it's also about time and staff resources to dedicate to things. Other organizations may be only to issue a letter of support. A downtown business association or a chamber of commerce is definitely helpful when pursuing a grant to know that they're supportive of it and understanding. So that may be the ask from them. On the other side of it, though, the gains for an organization like that in implementing this plan can be greater. A chamber of commerce may be only to give like a letter of support, but they stand to gain greater economic stability, greater employment stability when these types of things are put into place. And that needs to be the sales pitch for those of you on the advocacy side to give to them. And I think given where we are, I'm in Idaho, you're in Montana, we love that word freedom. And we've certainly taken away people's freedom by making the car the only choice we have in a lot of situations, and really tying back to the freedom of people, the freedom of children, and not be slotted into having to do one mode just to get around your city. Walking or biking to Bozeman, not very possible. You probably could get some transit services or enhance the ones that are there, but when you get home, why are we forcing somebody into a situation and taking away their freedom to get to a grocery store? So play on some of those local themes and things, and really get to the fundamental things behind why our country was founded. Walking and biking are technically protected methods under the Constitution. Driving is still a privilege, but we tend to think of those things in the opposite way. So I say that when you're asking for partnerships and asking what people can do, go through this exercise as a group or a committee to ask what are the gives and what are the gains to see where you are. Because sometimes if you ask the Chamber of Commerce what they can give and gain, their answers may be very different than what you think they can give and gain. And we need to understand those things. That brings to mind the programs that we identified that I think the advocates and organizations can definitely take part in. I mentioned the walk audits and the counts previously. There was the great ideas for a trail use and orientation program just to teach trail etiquette and trail stewardship. PCEC went out and did some safe routes to school surveys to understand things with the schools. And there's lots of things that can be done around that in terms of bike rodeos and walk to school and bike to school days, that there are materials from national organizations that I think are primed programs for people on this call to do. One of my favorite ones, if you've been in a large city and taken part in what's called a critical mass ride, where you get 500 bicyclists just to basically go down and and cause some good trouble on streets. And the funnest part I had was just riding constantly in circles around the same roundabout. You could do a softer one called a kiddical mass ride. Get a community bike ride with kids, get the police to support you, and just have a fun time doing that. Pop-up demonstrations. When I was in Missoula for a concert back in in August, they were doing two things. They were doing a Sunday streets where about a 4-block section of roads were closed to vehicles, and they had food trucks and in-street skate parks. But it coincided with what we would call a pop-up demonstration or a tactical urbanism project. You can see in the top image where all they did to create a temporary curb extension to help reduce vehicle speeds and raise the visibility of pedestrians was they used paint and reflective candlesticks to create those temporary improvements. And the bottom one are some temporary traffic circles or roundabouts that they put in there. So something like a H Street at Geyser is one that under the right circumstances, you could pilot one of these to see how it works. And maybe those turn into full projects. And there's plenty of examples where these things have worked just fine in this particular form. And I was happy to see it being done in Missoula for a Montana example to show that all the fears over winter weather and all the other things that could get in the way of that can be accomplishable. I'm not showing you something from South Florida in that scenario. I know some of you already do the type of sidewalk and seasonal maintenance on the pathway, or the snow removal and seasonal maintenance on the pathways and trails. Keep that up. That's about going back to the city and asking what you can do. And then other themes for wayfinding or bike tourism. But the last thing I want to bring up that I think this is something that PCEC and its partners could kind of help lead with the city's endorsement. And nationally, there are two things, a walk-friendly community and a bicycle-friendly community program that you can get designated as and fill out an application to be. You'll see on the walk-friendly community side, there are none in Montana. And what they do is they ask you to go through a questionnaire about how the city's conditions are and what they are doing to make a walkable city. On the bicycle friendly side, they have the same thing, and you're rated like you would be in the Olympics with bronze, silver, gold, but they also award platinum status to that. The good thing about both of those is even if you're not granted that status the first time around, the organizations that manage these programs will give you feedback about things to prioritize and move forward. And I've seen a lot of communities that, for example, on the walk-friendly community side, might get a bronze status. And instead of using it to celebrate, ooh, we got bronze, they use it as the kickoff as their Go for Gold campaign to really say that this is only the beginning and not the end of this designation. I talked to Sarah this morning. June 15th is the deadline for the League of American Bicyclists, bicycle-friendly business applications, and any city, nonprofit, private business can apply for that. They will ask you questions about if you have on-site bike racks, if you allow people or provide incentives for people to bike, if you provide showers for people to shower if they bike to work, but they also ask how an organization is involved in the community to promote bicycling. So as you can imagine, a lot of bike shops and things around that industry are bicycle-friendly businesses, but the city of Livingston could be a bicycle-friendly business. PCEC, if you have a local employer that's a small company, it's not that hard to achieve this, but this helps build recognition for that. And when we look through the list in Montana, there are 2 private businesses in Bozeman, 3 or 4 entities in Billings, and 2 or 3 in Missoula, but there aren't many. So PCEC, for example, if they could pull this application together by June 15th, could be the first bicycle-friendly business designated in Livingston and can pursue those things. So that is kind of it. One of the things we have in the final chapter for the City Commission and others is what we call action steps for implementation. And again, this is where you can be those positive gnats of coming back regularly and going, okay, these are our 10 action steps. How many of them have we checked off? And one of them is adopt the plan. And while that might seem rudimentary, you would probably be shocked at the number of plans where lots of public money has been done and they are collecting industrial levels of dust in the cloud because they've never been actually adopted. So adopting the plan in the next week is a good affirmation of we endorse this, we're committed to that. And then it's about finding those early wins. Adopting and updating the policies for the city, especially stemming from your growth policy update, is probably the next thing. And then the other part that the city's already doing is starting the implementation process for those high priority projects. So in theory, within 6 months, you could have 3 pretty strong check boxes in here of stuff that's already done or in progress. And I hope that shows that the process wasn't done in vain and that the city and its many partners are interested in that. So with that, as we say, what's next? The online story map is there for public review and the link to the final survey with the city commission adoption coming up next week. My message for you is bike the bike, walk the walk, take the bus, keep on trucking, keep on doing the things you're doing to make Livingston better, because when I leave, I'm turning that over to you in the city. And I want to come back there to explore and to hike and to attend some of the ribbon cuttings for these projects.
Thank you, Don. That was a lot of information compacted into a short amount of time. And I took a lot of notes and will rewatch the recording. A lot more to do on advocacy than is kind of expected. So thank you for breaking those boundaries and in different ways we can get involved. I know we've lost some people and that's okay. We've gone a little bit over. I do want to leave a bit of space for those of you that have stuck around. If there are any more questions, comments, points of clarification, that you can raise your hand or come off mute. And I'm not seeing any.
Sarah?
Oh, yes.
This is Tandy. I just wondered if the infrastructure, why it wouldn't be that the infrastructure bill that just passed Congress wouldn't apply to these expenditures. This is definitely infrastructure.
Yes, great question. So, get on another soapbox here. We do a great job passing legislation at the federal level. Unfortunately, the federal government allows states to make up their own rules within many of those programs and determining how that's done. So yes, a lot of these projects would be eligible to be done at the federal level. The one challenge is they all require what's called a federal match. And so say if we are proposing a $100,000 project, I think in Montana, the federal government will pay about 90% of that, and the local agency has to pay 10% of that. So if it's $100,000 and you're paying $10,000, that's not a heavy lift, but that won't get you very far. If you are packaging these to be $1 million worth of projects, that means it's $100,000 expenditure for the city, and that might be a heavier lift. You bring up a great point. The League of American Bicyclists, America Walks, and a group called the Vision Zero Network are kind of in the throes of doing a series, also Transport for America, a series of webinars for people like your local advocates to understand those things. And I think the most powerful thing for you is to ask those questions of MDT and get answers for them, because a lot of it will be available, but MDT will be able to determine how they judge projects and how they ultimately award the money. Federal funds typically cost more on a per dollar basis because of the additional federal requirements. So something that's maybe only $100,000 might not be as economical as packaging $1 million together, just because we know a federally funded project can probably cost anywhere from 20 to 30% more than if you just built it locally. So great question. Watch those webinars, ask MDT, and I can guarantee you they're not expecting you to ask those questions of them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tandy. Anybody else have a quick question? I know I had a quick question just on the rapid flashing beacons. Some of the pushback we get on our infrastructure, with curb extensions and et cetera, as well as these lights, is preserving the historical character of our town. And those pieces are seen to be as non-historical, including, trees, extensions, rapid flashing beacons, et cetera. So I don't know if there is alternatives or if pushing that it's more about safety and our rights as walkers and bikers is more important than preserving that character.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good question on that. I mean, it's, I kind of sometimes joke that asphalt pavement isn't all that historical either, but we don't talk about ripping that out. And there's certainly a lot of other signs there. And that's bring up the whole issue of finding other ways to also reduce the clutter of other things that are there. So something like this, can be more effective, but not lead to the fear of, oh, we're just adding something else. And I think you bring it up correctly, if there probably needs to be a deeper conversation of the safety factor of those versus the other interests of that. I think I've seen a lot of projects get, delayed or derailed because of concerns over historic district elements and things, but they're generally accepted and can be done. And there are ways to soften the looks of them. It's just a community preference thing.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we've also heard the comment, cars. I mean, Lindsay, you've said it, and Dan Burden also has said it before, that cars are also not historical. So if we're making it historic, let's go the whole way.
Well, I'll bring you another example that could very well be. I know there was the discussion about curb extensions and things in the downtown in terms of filming and movies. There are lots of temporary ways to do those things that if you do have that demand, those things can be taken up for that time period. Even a temporary type of curb extension, and all of those RRFBs are on a post that has brackets so it breaks away if a vehicle hits it. So removing it for a week or two, if there is something like that, those things are certainly more amenable and movable than other fixed pieces that you probably already have in your streets.
That's a very good idea. Are there any last burning questions? I've kept you all a little bit later than expected. We will be having a follow-up email. And I know Dawn is always really amenable to answering our burning questions after the fact. But we will be organizing around some of these projects. And so we'd love for you all to get involved, sign up to receive Active Transportation Coalition emails, which is a little bit separate so that we don't bombard our whole email list with everything that's happening around our streets and trails. And yeah, there's a separate sign up for that if you want to get involved. But anything else from you, Dawn? Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everybody for sticking around for a little bit longer. And we'll see you soon. Enjoy the sunny and snowy weather out there.